With the horror genre having a long impact on cinema, how has the genre evolved, and as an audience, how have our reactions to fear changed along with it?
Your lemon squares taste like ass.
Welcome to another Slash Her Saturday where I talk about all things horror. My name is Em, aka Horror, and in today's video I will be talking about the history of cinematic horror and how the genre and audience have adapted. The feeling of being scared is one that is unique to each individual. It plays on our emotions, experiences, anxieties and fears. It's a feeling that lingers, sometimes for days, and affects all senses of the body. What one person may perceive as being scary might not affect the person sitting next to them in the same way. Whilst one person may find elevated horror frightening, the next may be affected more by slashers or horror movies based on the paranormal. Others might not find the horror genre scary at all and instead get these feelings from different genres. However, horror sets out to give an audience a fright and to penetrate their minds to deliver an experience of terror. It provides the viewer with a lens to encounter and confront their greatest fears, giving them an escape from reality, but playing into the psychological effects of fear. The horror genre itself is always evolving, and along with it, our reactions as audiences are changing to adapt with the evolution. It is widely believed that the first ever horror movie was Le Manoir du Diable, a short silent movie from 1896. This paved the way for horror movies to take form, with more silent movies such as Frankenstein in 1910, The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari in 1920, and Nosferatu in 1922 to really put a spotlight on the genre. These movies pioneered the genre using their imaginations and ideas to set the tone, with minimal material to use as references. Silent movies had very little to play with, so used visuals and body language to their advantage, setting the path for horror to take shape and evolve. They established many stylistic components for the genre, and their influences are still used to this day. The 1930s marked a pivotal moment in the horror genre. With the addition of sound in films, stories became richer and more immersive. Movies like Dracula and Frankenstein laid the groundwork for what horror could be. They combined gothic elements with the psychological fears of the time. Audiences were both terrified and fascinated. Theatrical reactions varied from screams to nervous laughter. Some scenes which were shown in these movies were perceived to be too much and over the top for the time. However, when looking back, these are now scenes which are often seen in horror movies and which are accepted as the horror norms. The 1940s has been considered to be a point in horror which had very little impact on the genre itself, being branded as the tail end of the 1930s horror. It did see the release of some classic horror movies such as The Wolfman and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. However, the impact World War II had on the industry was quite significant. In Britain, horror movies were banned from being distributed in the latter years of the war, often not being released until years after. Horror movies in the 1940s often played upon the psychological themes. However, some movies which were classed as horror during this period would now be considered under the thriller genre. The 40s was a time of worldwide poverty and destruction, with more real-life horror playing more of a role in the world. The aftermath of World War II during the 50s took horror to a new level. The genre began to heighten themes of paranoia, reflecting the anxieties of the time. Films like Invasion of the Body Snatchers became metaphors for conformity and loss of individuality. This is the era where drive-ins really became popular, with groups often spending a Friday or Saturday night being thrilled by a mixture of horror and sci-fi movies. Audiences were drawn into the spectacle of fear, often as a communal experience, but there were also societal pushbacks, with some showing concerns that these movies would corrupt the minds of the youth. The 1960s, however, proved to be revolutionary within horror, with films like Psycho reimagining the genre through psychological perspectives. Alfred Hitchcock's masterful manipulation of tension and suspense transformed horror from external monsters to internal demons. The infamous shower scene showed the vulnerability of the everyday person becoming victim to true horrors that the world can be capable of. Audiences were shook by the thought that anyone could be a victim. This new era prompted viewers to grapple with their own psychological fears, leading to more profound reactions. By the late 1960s, horror took a more radical turn. Night of the Living Dead addressed social issues head-on, with issues surrounding race, violence and societal decay. Audiences were jolted not only by the gore, but by the urgent commentary on their realities. This changed the view of horror, with audience seeing it not just being entertainment, but as a profound reflection of societal fears. The The 1970s were a turning point for horror films. They evolved from the classic Gothic styles to a new realism. The Exorcist introduced audiences to terror that felt frighteningly real, tackling subjects like possession and profound moral dilemmas, including religious beliefs to be questioned. We then saw movies which took horror in a new direction, such as Texas Chainsaw Massacre. The extreme violence of the picture pushed boundaries, with on-screen gore being seen in a way it had not been seen before, leaving audiences uncomfortable, making others question the choice of violence towards women, depicting them as vulnerable. The late 70s also brought in movies like Halloween, which influenced future movies, with the masked silent killer stalking its victims, giving slashers a new path to follow. The later years of the 70s also saw sci-fi horror emerge, with movies like Alien exploring different galaxies and timelines, bringing a new feeling of exploration and giving audiences new monsters to fear. Often referred to as the golden era of horror, the 1980s introduced franchises like Friday the 13th and A Nightmare on Elm Street, giving horror new household names in Jason and Freddy. There was a malevolence being portrayed which unnerved audiences. These movies showed a clear influence from their predecessors, which is something that continued into the next decade. The 80s also brought classics such as The Shining, which showed that the villain can be anyone, even the person you share a bed with. The anxieties these movies introduced were one that have stuck with the genre in general, with the gore aspect escalating and supernatural elements being made more central and feared. As we moved into the 1990s, horror began to reflect the changing cultural landscape. The rise of self-aware films like Scream introduced the meta element, poking fun at traditional tropes. Scream has proved to be revolutionary. It brought the rules of horror to the forefront, making the audiences really think about them and giving an insight into horror movies which had not been thought of from an audience's perspective previously. Although there are many other great movies in the 90s, Scream brought in a new audience, making fans more engaged, discussing the genre, identity tropes, and predicting outcomes. This has changed the way audiences look at the genre in general and is one of the only horror franchises to have such an impact as it has. However, the 90s were not just about slashers. The era also saw a shift in the psychological horror. Films like The Silence of the Lambs and Seven explored the darkest corners of the human psyche, merging horror with drama and crime, and creating a long-lasting tension. The 2000s took that shift and mixed psychological horror with torture themes, producing movies like Saw and Hostel, showcasing psychological and physical fear. These films explored themes of survival, trauma, and human depravity, reflecting societal fears and personal anxieties that many were grappling with. Digital media in the 2000s transformed how audiences engaged with horror. Online forums erupted with discussions about plot twists and character development, giving way to a more analytical fanbase. Platforms such as YouTube also became a way for creators to make their own films, express their views and discuss topics in general, which has proven to be a great place for horror. The 2010s marked a resurgence of innovative storytelling, using horror to address social issues. Films like Get Out and Hereditary illustrated race relations and family trauma, proving horror could also be thought-provoking. These films highlighted that horror isn't just about scares, and it can unpack societal structures and personal fears. Horror media became a canvas for cultural critique. Viewers responded by embracing horror as a means of confrontation. Audiences were not just scared, they were challenged and encouraged to reflect on the issues faced in society. We also saw independent films getting more recognition, with the most notable being Terrifier, which has pushed boundaries further when it comes to gore and how far one is willing to go. As we stepped into the 2020s, the whole world saw something happen that we could have only imagined seeing in a horror movie. When COVID hit, the world came to a complete stop, which affected not only our personal lives but also the entertainment industry. Movies were put on hold and streaming platforms became the new cinema, with new movies being directly released to these types of services. The 2020s has so far seen films explore varied fears, from climate change horror to technology's dark side. This year alone we have seen some great releases, such as The Substance, which relays meaningful messages in the most horrific and terrifying ways, using themes such as body horror to illustrate the meaning. Horror today is a reflection of our global anxieties, unafraid to tackle the uncomfortable truths of our reality. From silent movies of the 1800s and 1900s to the intricate narratives of 2024, horror has transformed significantly. Whilst a lot has changed throughout the horror movie journey, however, we can also see the influence early works has had. Although we may not see modern silent horror movies, the use of visual storytelling along with silence and music still plays a pivotal role to set a scene of suspense and tension. Audiences have also evolved alongside the genre changes, becoming more accepting of certain aspects of horror, but reacting not just with fear, but with introspection and conversation. So as always, what do you guys think? Are there any changes that you have noticed in the horror genre? Let me know down in the comments section. If you have enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe and switch on that notification button, as I will be uploading more content like this. Thank you so much for watching. You can check out my other content here. With that being said, I will see you in the next video.